Our starting point is that every country has the right to defend itself, and indeed it is the first duty of any government to protect its citizens. And over the last few decades, global efforts to prevent and reduce violent conflict and civil wars have grown and strengthened. International peace operations, often based on new alliances between the North and the South, have played a vital role in bringing stability to fragile states. But for many countries, every microphone is important to a politician seeking publicity, but for many countries, conflict and instability remain intractable problems fueled by the unregulated and irresponsible trade in arms. This year, the world faces a new opportunity to prevent and reduce violent conflict as nations come together in New York in July to try to conclude negotiations on a new arms trade treaty. Now, over the last 40 years, there have been many negotiations dealing with aspects of arms and defence. There were the series of negotiations aimed at reducing the bloated armories built up during the Cold War. There were then a series of nuclear anti-proliferation discussions. And more recently, there have been conventions that have addressed specific aspects of the arms trade, such as the Ottawa Convention that bans the sale of landmines, or the UN Programme of Action on the illicit trade of small arms and light weapons. The latter has commendable aims and has begun to address the problem of small arms and light weapons, but is limited in its focus, is non-binding, and has been hampered by disagreement. Through the Arms Trade Treaty, we now have the chance to agree a mechanism which comprehensively regulates the trade in all conventional weapons, large and small. Now, this is a development issue just as much as it is a security issue. Without security, children cannot go to school, hospitals cannot function, farming cannot take place, and commerce cannot thrive. In short, violent conflict and insecurity ingrain poverty. They threaten our chances of setting this world on a path to peace and prosperity. Now, we've witnessed time and time again conflict and violence being fueled by the uncontrolled sale of weapons. It's the small arms, the guns and the rifles that have empowered armed groups and which have escalated armed violence and resulted literally in millions of deaths. The illegal or simply poorly regulated trade in arms costs lives and blights futures. More than 740,000 men, women and children die each year as a result of armed violence. And 2/3 of these deaths occur in countries that technically are not in conflict. So what does this show us? Well, it shows us that easy access to portable weapons is a major factor in causing these deaths. And this government is determined to do everything within its power to make sure that the most rigorous international standards are applied to the export of and trade in arms. It's the only way to stop weapons falling into the wrong hands and for being used for an inexcusable purpose. Now, Britain already operates one of the strongest arms control systems in the world, demanding the highest standards from our defence industry so that we can be sure that we are not fueling these dreadful trends. And it's encouraging to see that the world community is now planning to come together to agree a legally binding treaty to apply international high standards for the trade and transfer of arms. Internationally, there is now a strong will to make an arms trade treaty a reality. Now, the UK has been promoting this from the outset. It was the UK who introduced the initial resolution in the UN in December 2006 calling for an arms trade treaty, and the resolution was co-authored with 6 countries: Australia, Argentina, Costa Rica, Finland, Kenya, and Japan. Negotiations began in 2010, and the final negotiation conference will be in July this year. The FCO will be leading negotiations for the UK, and DFID, the MOD, and the Business Innovation and Skills Department will all be represented on our national delegation. Now, achieving consensus by the end of the negotiating conference on a treaty text which meets our objectives will be challenging. However, we're very determined and will make every effort to attain this goal. Between now and July, the UK government will be working to raise the profile of and support for this treaty. We will be working with our counterparts across the world to bring them on board. We'll be demonstrating to our public why we believe this is so important. And I want today to explain just why we feel so strongly about this and why we are pushing for global standards. First, I want to examine the scale of the problem. Second, I want to look at how unregulated arms transfers affect development. And then I'd like to offer some thoughts as to what the arms treaty should look like. Now, currently, a variable patchwork of regulation exists across the world. Some governments have very robust arms trade control systems in place, but other governments are fueling the illicit and irresponsible trade in arms by not having any control systems at all, or by only having systems that are very weak. Overall, there are no common international standards for the arms trade, and this results in gaps and loopholes which can be exploited. So first, let's just look in a bit more detail at the impact of unregulated and irresponsible arms sales. Every year, armed violence kills nearly 750,000 people. To pick a few examples, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, close to 4 million people have died in armed conflict over the last decade. In Nepal, 10 years of conflict has left more than 12,000 people dead and hundreds of thousands displaced. In 2011, an estimated 70,000 people were displaced from eastern Darfur in a wave of ethnically targeted attacks. Corrupt or irresponsible dealers are selling and diverting weapons into war zones, thus fueling conflict. For example, in Uganda, armed groups are known to have previously operated surreptitiously to obtain weapons from Sudan, and these weapons ultimately led to an enormous cost in human life. The suffering caused by the illicit market in arms has been immense. In Uganda, at least 23,000 children and adults were abducted by the Lord Resistance Army, the LRA. Young boys were trained as child soldiers. Young girls were taken to work as slaves, while others were raped and abandoned. Some children have been killed or injured in crossfire or in armed attacks and cattle raids. And in Sudan, a similar picture emerges. Women and children are the most vulnerable in Sudan's internal conflict. Not only are they caught in the crossfire of conflict itself, but they are targets of inter-community raids, and they're most affected by a lack of access to clean water, to food, healthcare, and education in areas where conflict persists. The groups who perpetrated these atrocities would not have been able to operate without access to a constant source of weapons and ammunition. And just because a weapon is small and light does not mean that it is not a vicious driver of conflict and suffering. Easily transported, small arms and light weapons account for an estimated 60 to 90% of conflict deaths, as well as tens of thousands of additional deaths outside actual war zones. It's estimated that more than 95% of all the small arms in Africa, for example, come from outside the continent. Another example is Yemen, where 60% of families report ownership of weapons. With approximately 10 million small arms for a population of 23 million people, Yemen is considered among the most heavily armed countries on earth. And the availability of weapons in Yemen, however small they may be, is frequently linked to the rapid escalation of armed violence as witnessed during the instability sparked by the Arab Spring, and to the aggravation of disputes over land and water resources in which up to 4,000 people die every year. Now, the end effect is hindrance to the country's development in both rural and urban areas. Now, I believe that an arms trade treaty can make a major contribution to reducing and preventing this sort of conflict. it will make it much harder for armed groups and governments that commit human rights abuses to acquire a ready flow of weapons. As if violent conflict were not bad enough in itself, it also has a significant bearing on a country's potential for development. It's clear that armed conflict and armed violence prevent countries from benefiting from the social and economic development that they might otherwise enjoy. The internationally agreed Millennium Development Goals range from halving extreme poverty to halting the spread of HIV/AIDS and to providing primary universal education, all by the target date of 2015. Now, while we may have made some good progress addressing disease and hunger, it is now arguable that conflict has become the greatest enemy of development. About 2/3 of the countries least likely to achieve the Millennium Development Goals are in the midst of or emerging from conflict. Even when conflict is simmering and not quite exploding, how can governments provide universal health care or primary education when their budgets are being diverted to corrupt or irresponsible arms purchases? There's no way a state can build up a comprehensive health system when there is no stability and security, and where they are being forced to address the challenges of bloodshed and injury caused by armed violence, and doing that ahead of other healthcare demands. How can a state provide primary education when armed violence is preventing or deterring children and teachers simply from getting to their school? Economic growth is the route out of poverty, but violence and conflict is a fast route back into it. It's estimated that each year Africa forgoes wealth totaling $18 billion as a result of armed conflict. So make no mistake, the irresponsible trade in arms hits the most vulnerable the hardest. Now, of course, the problems don't stop just when the fighting stops. Taking the experience of many countries which have faced conflict, it takes perhaps 20 years for an economy to recover after the actual conflict has ended. Now, to understand this picture fully, we have to ask what is driving this phenomenon. At one level, the defense business is one of the most technologically pioneering and inventive sectors of industry. But we have to be honest. In addition to the legitimate arms business, the arms trade is subject to some of the most unscrupulous, greedy, and immoral practices of any industry. So many times we've heard of arms dealers who are criminals, selling illicitly and often getting away with it. A recent example is that of Victor Boot, convicted on terrorism charges after being accused of planning to smuggle arms to the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. And it's said that over many years, Boot supplied arms to some of the most brutal regimes and civil wars of the last 2 decades. We can't allow this to continue in an unregulated, tacitly authorized way. There are many defense companies and states, those with good controls and good practices, who support an arms trade treaty. The treaty's objective is to establish a fair and equitable foundation for legitimate arms trading. And I am today appealing for all countries to push for an arms trade treaty so we can ensure that no more arms deals take place outside a framework of global standards. So let me now turn to what the arms trade treaty could and should look like. An international arms trade treaty will ensure the global trade in arms is subject to high standards. The treaty will be a legally binding agreement supported by monitoring and reporting mechanisms that sets out very clear standards for arms transfers across international boundaries. Before exporting arms, states will have to assess and consider an important list of criteria. The list must include the risk of the exported arms being used in human rights abuses or to fuel conflict, the potential impact of the export on sustainable development, and the risk of the weapons being subject to diversion or corrupt practices. To be effective and worthwhile, the treaty must be broad in scope, covering all elements from fighter jets to ammunition. Small arms and light weapons must be in the scope of the treaty. If they're not, the opportunity to regulate a major contributor to conflict and suffering will have been missed. So the UK, working hand in hand with most of the world's developing nations, will push to ensure that small arms and light weapons are in the scope of the treaty, because leaving them out would be an act of negligence. Under the terms of the Chair's document and under the terms of the treaty we want, states will need to demonstrate transparency in their arms trade, and they will be required to introduce reporting and transparency measures. This should include publishing a national export control list and detailed national reports of arms exports. States will also need to demonstrate their progress on implementing the treaty requirements by submitting regular progress reports. Reporting will enable our citizens to hold us to account for the arms transfers that we authorize and make. Corruption is a major problem in the arms trade. The unregulated covert trade in arms conducted by corrupt individuals or companies leads to the diversion of weapons into the illicit market or to dangerous end users. Corruption also undermines the ability of nations to ensure they are paying a fair and uninflated price for the weapons. Corruption allows individuals to profit from a nation's pain with impunity. We want to push for the Arms Trade Treaty to address the issues of corruption, bribery, and the lack of transparency which all allow these practices to continue unnoticed. And one of the ways I want the treaty to do this is by including measures to control arms brokering. This could be achieved by all states having a register of arms brokers. Such measures will close loopholes by ensuring brokers are accountable to the law wherever they are operating. States will have to prosecute brokers and all other individuals involved in corrupt practices. I believe the treaty and its provisions must also recognize the impact of irresponsible and illegal arms transfers on the most vulnerable, including women. Strong provisions on human rights will assist in this respect. However, considering the disproportionate impact armed violence has on women, we also hope to see reference to this included in the treaty's preamble. Now, this is an ambitious project. Many states do not have export control systems at all, and it will be a significant commitment for these states to establish systems which adhere to the strong standards of the arms trade treaty we want to see. It will therefore be important that the international community recognizes and responds to the need for international cooperation and assistance, including technical and financial assistance in countries which will need help in effectively implementing the Arms Trade Treaty. The UK believes that this must be a strong, effective treaty. However, we also realize that compromises will have to be made. While many states are as supportive of a treaty as we are, there are others who have their reservations. And I and my ministerial colleagues will be working with international counterparts to try and overcome such doubts. Now, I'm concerned that some do not see the value of having criteria on sustainable development in the treaty, or they mistakenly interpret it as threatening developing states' sovereignty and their right to defend themselves and to spend their budgets as they see fit. Others don't want ammunition or small arms and light weapons in the treaty's scope. I think the inclusion of these is critical. If small arms and light weapons were not included in any agreement, it would dangerously undermine its impact. In our view, a country's record and approach to human rights should determine whether or not it is a fitting buyer of weapons, and we want to see this provision contained in the treaty. And I am concerned that some states are still resisting this inclusion. So don't misunderstand me. We are encouraged to see the breadth of support that does exist for the treaty. The EU, Sub-Saharan Africa, and much of the Caribbean are vocal supporters. The co-authors of the treaty resolution are continually pushing for the most ambitious scope and provisions. The P5 have come a long way and have issued a supportive statement last July. The majority of UN member states want to see criteria regulating the export of arms. They want most conventional weapons in the scope, and they believe that states must retain some record of their arms transfers. Meanwhile, UK civil society and industry are demonstrating their support, showing the world that all in the UK are united in their support for a treaty. So, in July, all the states of the United Nations will meet in New York for 4 weeks of intensive negotiations. The United Kingdom will be at the forefront of these negotiations and will work hard to ensure that the conference ends with a robust treaty which the majority of nations will sign. The UK fully believes that the value of such a treaty is enormous, and we are determined to agree one that will achieve real change. We cannot have a treaty that does not introduce legally binding regulations or which does not include those weapons that are causing the most human suffering. So let me stress, a treaty will not prevent any country from being able to defend itself. Indeed, a state security force, when properly trained and resourced, can play a valuable role in ensuring stability and in creating a climate in which development can flourish. An internationally agreed treaty will, however, close loopholes and gaps in legislation, and it will ensure that globally high standards are in place to prevent irresponsible arms transfers taking place. It is long overdue. Let no one be in any doubt about our determination. I hope that all countries will share our view, because the world will be watching to see who refuses to sign up to an arms trade treaty. I think it's a credit to the UK that such a united front in support of a treaty has emerged across government, industry, NGOs, and public opinion. I hope this will be shared across the world, as the eyes of the world will be focused on any country which fails to sign up. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. We have about half an hour or so for questions and comments. If you'd like to make an intervention, please get my attention, and then a microphone will eventually, I hope, find its way to you. Can we start off, please, with Richard Norton-Taylor from The Guardian?
Thank you. Britain's a major exporter, and it has some of the biggest, I think, manufacturing companies are arms companies. You talk about consensus, and competition is obviously quite important, level playing field, I suppose, to coin a cliche. And you talk about consensus. What happens if the standards get quite low, because that's the only way to get a consensus? The Americans, for example, haven't agreed to something quite specific, and one would have thought easier, i.e. a cluster bomb treaty. Would BAE, for example, agree to a treaty which binds Britain but not, say, its competitors? And I was thinking really the point about the consensus, how low will the bar be to actually get a consensus?
Richard, your point is absolutely valid, that the danger is we get sucked down to the level of the lowest common denominator. And that is very much the purpose of my speech today. It's to try to overcome that danger and try to raise the profile of this issue so that world opinion can help drive governments to reaching a consensus which is pitched at a high level. So we want as much as possible included in a treaty. As I said in my speech, there will have to be compromises. Inevitably, when you're trying to corral world opinion into a single position, some things get cast out. But we very much hope that after nearly 6 years now of discussing this internationally, July can signal a successful conclusion to a workable treaty. There's too much that's going wrong in the world. We already, I think, in this country have very high standards, and it should be our mission to try and lift other people's standards to the ones we already meet.
You mentioned in your speech that there were at least 3 areas of controversy, as it were. One being the inclusion of criteria on sustainable development, the other the inclusion of small arms and light weapons, a third this correlation between human rights records to the fitness of somebody to be a purchaser. In your experience of the negotiations so far, which of those 3 is proving the source of the most resistance?
I think it's inappropriate for me to sort of try and give a running commentary on people's negotiating positions and what the mood is. The Foreign Office is in the lead on the negotiations, and here we are in May looking towards July, where all these intensive discussions will take place. What I would reiterate, however, is that it is absolutely essential to include smaller weapons in the treaty, because if we don't, the marginal gain in securing a treaty will be seriously impaired. So light weapons, which can cause just as much, if not more, conflict and death than the large ones, which may be in an arsenal but not used, are as an essential part of this treaty. So small weapons must be in there. Of course, we are going to argue for the full position I listed, including human rights, the danger of violence against women, and sustainable development. Because when a country, often for the gain of a political leader, is purchasing weapons and diverting an enormous fraction of a country's budget to weapons purchases, the scope for that country to address the needs of the poor is seriously impaired.
Lady here in the second row on the right-hand side.
Thank you. Kate Allen, Amnesty International. And thank you, Minister, for that speech, which very much welcome. And we very much welcome from Amnesty International the work that we've done with your government and previous governments on the Arms Trade Treaty. For Amnesty International, this has been a campaign for over 2 decades. And when my predecessors first started talking about this 2 decades ago, there was great skepticism that there could ever be such a treaty. And here we are within a couple of months of something that could be absolutely transformative for the world. So thank you very much for all of the work that is taking place. My anxiety and the anxiety of the 3.5 million members of Amnesty that have campaigned for so long is that the compromises at the last moment will pull the rug out from under what this treaty can really, really achieve. And so for us, those elements in terms of human rights and sustainable development are essential components and not ones that should be traded at the last minute for a compromise. Thank you.
I fully understand your position, and I think it reflects enormously well on the UK that the support for this treaty joins NGOs with politics and the defence industry. And to cover such a broad spectrum of interests is I think, unique in probably any field of government. Certainly feels like that at the moment. I think that Britain is in a strong moral position to argue the corner and, as it were, to go for the full laundry list. I think that if we were to exclude small weapons, I mean, that would be the worst of all. But we have to make sure that we can include as much as we possibly can.
Christian Lemire, just in the middle, right-hand side.
Thank you, Minister. One of the motivations for this treaty appears to be to deprive non-state armed groups of small arms and light weapons, and therefore the means to wage conflict. But is it not sometimes in the foreign policy interest of the UK to have such groups well armed and active? I think of, for instance, Libya last year or Syria this year. And could one of the unintended consequences of this treaty not be to actually stabilise repressive regimes that regularly engage in human rights abuses by denying non-state armed groups the means to wage resistance to those regimes?
I don't think so, because I think this would depend very much on, as it were, your moral calculus as to the purpose to which any weapons would be put. So I don't believe that it would, for instance, have excluded the arming of the Benghazi rebels against a dictator like Muammar Gaddafi. But you're quite right that it would put such a decision under a serious spotlight of scrutiny and assessment. But I don't think it would, and so long as a state actor believes that within the terms of the treaty the weapons are in the right hands for the right purpose, horrible though a conflict that would ensue might be, then they would not fall foul of the treaty.
And you say in the second row here again. Yes, please.
Sir, good morning. Peter Asprey, member of the Institute. Really to pick up on the last point and to be a sort of devil's advocate, I wonder whether one of the risks of this treaty is that, or one of the reasons for leaving arms trade unregulated is that it helps to keep those who might otherwise have a monopoly of violence, keep them honest. And I wonder whether the answer to that is to make sure that transparency is perhaps a keystone in the terms of the treaty, so that accountability is always possible.
Well, it is. Transparency and open reporting is an essential criterion within the terms of the treaty that's being discussed at the moment. I mean, I should reiterate that there's no such thing as an absolutely detailed draft treaty at the moment. There are, versions there for discussion, and which can be tabled and bits of it objected to. This will take the best part of a month. But you are absolutely right, and in asking for transparency, if we get the treaty that we want, you're going to get it. And that's a great weapon for putting the spotlight of knowledge on the business and on the contracts that are awarded, exactly as you're suggesting.
Alex Nichols.
Thank you, Minister. I just wondered what are your expectations of defence manufacturers, both during the period leading up to, in the negotiation of a treaty and then afterwards during the implementation? What would you like them to be doing and saying?
Please continue with the support that you have already shown. I mean, as I was saying earlier, I think this reflects enormously well on our defence industry, whose interests lie in seeing other people be as responsible as they are. The danger for them, of course, is that the lack of regulation will allow if you like, the bad guys to get the edge and the good guys lose. In a way, this was often the argument used about the Bribery Act, that if we set our standards on a very high level, we are pipped at the post by people who don't meet the same standards. So some kind of equitable code of conduct entrenched in a treaty and enforced by responsible nation states is in the interests of responsible defence manufacturers, and the support that they have given for this over many years now is, in my view, admirable.
On the question perhaps of enforcement, I mean, getting member states to sign up to this is obviously the key thing, but then as the UK government would envisage it, how would this operate in terms of the monitoring, compliance, implementation, and are there any considerations being given to mechanisms to penalise people who breach this treaty?
I mean, the question of penalties has not been debated very much. It may yet emerge in the discussions in July. But, I mean, just to coin a phrase off the top of my head, don't take this as, sort of a formally considered label. It's what you might call sort of consensual exposure, in that we're not setting up an international police force through this, but by countries joining and ratifying the treaty, they will commit to annual or more frequent meetings in which all of the activities of their defence industry exports are laid bare. And that provides an enormous weapon to the likes of Amnesty International and public opinion about where people, and a free media, about where weapons are going and why. So that would dramatically change much of the arms industry from the covert to the overt. And that in itself is such a dramatic shift, it would make an enormous difference.
Thanks. Mark Fitzpatrick.
Mark Fitzpatrick, a senior fellow at the Institute. I know that the Foreign Office has been promoting this treaty for many years. Back when I used to be with the State Department, I recall discussions at the working level that didn't get very far. There wasn't a great receptivity in Washington. I'm pleased that there now is. I imagine this is partly because of different political leadership, which, given the questions about what the leadership will be in November, argues well for having a treaty discussions in July. I'm curious at what level, if you're able to say, at what level discussions will be ensuing, given, I know that the United States is one of the countries that isn't fully on board all of the provisions that you are advocating. At what level are you trying to work these issues out?
I think it will, as it were, go up the ladder, I imagine, as D-Day approaches towards the end of July. But senior officials are working on this and have been for a long time. We envisage having ministerial representation in New York. It's primarily Foreign Office. I may well be there for some part of it, but it's a month-long process, so one wouldn't expect ministers to be there all the time. I note what you say about American politics. One would hope that in July, as the presidential election approaches, there will still be decisions of this significance that can be taken, and that there will be adequate receptivity.
James Hackett.
Thanks, Adam. Just a couple of slightly technical questions. To what degree will the treaty address dual-use technologies that straddle the sort of security and military sector? And also, will it, as you envisage it, address the trade in materials that can be used to manufacture, let's say, charges and warheads by states that have indigenous production facilities?
Don't hold me to this in great detail, but whether, as it were, the components of weapons manufacture will be included or not and how will be part of the negotiations. And a lot of this can be left to the sort of export license regimes of individual countries who sign up to the treaty. I mean, it's always a very difficult problem. I mean, talking as a member of Parliament, I have had a case a number of years ago where an export license to Iran was withdrawn. It was designed for a gas turbine, but it was thought it could be used for military purposes. And so there are always these difficult judgments to be made, and within a country's sovereign right, they can still, of course, make these decisions about whether they permit or not, but it would be open. So, people will still have their export license agreements, and they could, I suppose, be more strict than the apparent requirements of a treaty, if they so wished.
Gentleman here in the third row.
Thanks. Sajid Ali Khan, an ordinary member of this institute. While I wish you luck in what you're aiming at, and you'll need that luck, could you explain how do you expect if a fundamental treaty which came out from Nuremberg, 12th of August 1946, that condemned aggressive war and became what's known as the superior law in the United States, which promptly shut it over his shoulder. So if that can't be enforced, would you not be just better off having an informal treaty among your arms manufacturers? And I have to tell you, my fellow Pathans and also Frontier make first-class small arms without any problem.
Yes. Notwithstanding your first point, we're under no illusions that this is going to just totally purify the world. But we hope it will make a significant marginal improvement in an industry which, when wrongly practiced or conducted, can cause so much suffering. So this is not a panacea which is going to solve all ills, but we hope it's going to take or represent a quantum leap in improving an industry which at the moment is pretty well unregulated and gives rise to so much death, misery, and trade, which causes so much damage. So if we can improve some things, it's better than doing nothing.
Further questions? Yes, lady here in the centre.
Thank you, Minister. Anna MacDonald with Oxfam, and I'd echo the words of my Amnesty colleague in very much welcoming your speech today. The reasons that you've articulated for the negative impact on development of the arms trade is very much why Oxfam has been involved in pushing for an arms trade treaty for so long. And as such, we see the criteria that you outlined around sustainable development as being particularly important, and the negative impacts on the economies of so many developing countries of the poorly regulated arms trade are immense. And I wonder whether in the important work that you are describing that you're doing between now and July, you might consider discussing with your equivalent ministers from other equivalent departments to DFID in other major donor countries to see whether they might promote this as robustly as you are.
Thank you. And, you know, Oxfam, everyone recognises, has been one of the leading advocates of this treaty and has analysed in detail what should be in it and tried to promote what should be in it. Yes is the answer to your question. I mean, we see this as not just, as it were, DFID to other development ministers, but as I listed in my speech, I mean, there'll be 4 government departments working very closely together in this country on this treaty, and in the same way as I would expect to speak regularly to many development ministers in other countries, so I'm sure the Department for Business and the Foreign Office and the MOD would do the same. So this will take and involve a lot of ministerial lobbying, and I think we're all going to be pretty busy between now and the end of July, and I hope we can bring on board many of those who at the moment are resisting some of the ingredients of this treaty we'd like to see.
Gentleman here in the front.
Thanks. Roy Asbister from Safe World, and Safe World works closely with Oxfam and Amnesty on this issue and has done for a long time. 2 quick questions. One, I think we're all aware of and fearful of what compromises might be proposed in July. On the issue of the scope, you've mentioned being very strong on small arms and light weapons, which is very good to hear. You mentioned on one occasion, I think, that that ammunition must be in the treaty. I think something that concerns me, that where one of these compromises might lie is, well, okay, we'll get small arms and light weapons, but not ammunition. So I'd just be interested if you could speak a little bit more on how strong ammunition, your support for ammunition is in this context. The other question...
Can I answer that question first? Can I do one at a time? But by all means come back with a second, because this is so important. Let me issue, as it were, a health warning on this. Let me be blunt, with the tone with which you use the word compromise. As if it's implying that if we agree to a treaty that doesn't have certain things in it, that it's somehow going to be our fault. I don't like that. We've got the full laundry list. You know, we want the works in there. And the sort of suggestion is that somehow, if we have to jettison something in order to get a broad treaty, that we will be culpable. We are going to press for everything to the maximum. But it's other countries who do not share our maximalist view. So we are going to, but we have to be realistic that we are into one of the biggest and most complex collective negotiations here that you could ask for in almost any field of government. So, you know, we are going to go for the thing, but you have to appreciate, as we do, that in foreign affairs, this is sort of foreign affairs, morality is rarely black and white. It's all about settling for a shade of grey somewhere. And ultimately, we are going to have to decide, possibly, whether we hold out for our full list and risk not getting a treaty at all, or conceding something in order to get the best treaty we can possibly get. So I would urge you to be very realistic and practical about what negotiations in an international forum are all about. And we want the most, but we have to realize that getting the most is not going to be that easy. The second question.
Thanks, Minister. And I've spent a lot of weeks in the UN basement in this, so I do appreciate just how challenging this is going to be. The other question relates to, you mentioned again that there's a lot of support from, for example, countries in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, etc. You've also mentioned that it's a 1-month-long negotiating process, and this presents challenges in terms of resources. So I was wondering if there's anything, and especially with DFID, you being the DFID minister, if there's any thought being given to how to assist some of the less capacitated states on being able to attend for the full 4 weeks, and so that they can get their voice across. Thank you.
No, that's a very fair question. I mean, where we can enable a country to represent its own interests and not be denied that representation because, you know, their own little government won't pay for the air tickets and the hotel or something for a full month, then I quite understand what you're saying. We don't want to appear, on the other hand, to be buying other countries' support. You know, we don't want this to be misinterpreted. I will, when I get back, find out what support we may be giving to this. We have given in the past a lot of technical assistance to advocacy assistance to smaller nations who find these international fora quite a daunting area in which to work. And I fully take your point that we don't want to exclude anybody because they haven't got the resources. So we'll go back and look at that. Yeah.
Ben Barry.
Ben Barry from the Institute and a former British Army expert on small arms and light weapons. Minister, can I congratulate you on the very clear case you presented, and I echo utterly the sentiments of Amnesty International and Oxfam. But I think there's a real practical difficulty on small arms and light weapons, which is the ease in which they're manufactured. And the weapon shop in the front room of a house in Peshawar emphasises this. Now, I think we've forgotten this in Britain because we effectively don't have a small arms industry other than expensive shotguns and a few target rifles. Other countries do. And I must admit that if I was a repressive state and saw this coming, I'd be doing the staff work now about setting up my own small arms industry, which would be modestly more expensive than importing this stuff, but eminently doable.
Yeah, I totally understand. I mean, this treaty would not cover what might be described as homemade weapons used within the borders of the country in which something is made. It is about trade across international borders. And so inasmuch as an effective treaty would be a form of sanctions, or at least policing, your logic is undeniable. However, I think particularly where there are non-functioning states and states on the edge of failure where that kind of industry simply does not exist, an international arms trade treaty would make a significant difference to the supply of weapons into a conflict area, without which there would be less conflict. So, yes, you have a point, but I don't think it's universally applicable.
Gentleman, just about 4 rows back on the back.
Thank you. Rob Wright with Transparency International. Thank you, Minister, for your talk this morning, and particularly for the very strong line that the UK is taking on the inclusion of anti-corruption measures in the treaty, recognising that corruption is one thing which can completely undermine the effective application of the other criteria in the treaty if it's not addressed. So we very much welcome that. You mentioned in your talk the P5, and we touched on one Western member of the P5 a few moments ago. Russia and China are clearly less than fully enthusiastic for much of what is in the treaty at the moment, and I think corruption is one of the areas where they might be quite tricky. Are they on your list of people to go and visit or people to talk to in the coming weeks?
Assume my list is as long as the list of countries in the world. I wish at this point not to be invidious and list sort of countries that might not be as supportive other people, clever analysts, to do. Just take it that, you know, we are fully aware of who are fully on board and who are less so, and we'll use our full diplomatic efforts to try and gather the broadest and deepest support we can for what we hope will be a conclusive set of negotiations in July.
Yes, lady in the back here. Well, two of you. So, yes, you please start now.
Yeah. Thank you very much. My name is Ines from Weitershausen. I'm a PhD student here at the LSE. And I would like you to comment, please, on what is going to happen after New York. So once a treaty has been signed, including some of the compromises you just mentioned, are there any initiatives of those like-minded partners you mentioned to further work on incentives for maybe a treaty at some point that includes areas that are at that point not included. Part of it? Thank you.
Well, let's get what we can get first and work out what we might need to get further later. I think that all eyes have to be on July, and we just have to bank what we possibly can. And the negotiations themselves will design the ratification process and the process by which a country's adherence to the treaty is triggered and implemented. So, there's so much that has to be in this negotiation pot. I think we just ought to look at that for the time being and not at what might then be necessary in addition. So let's get, as it were, the treaty in place before we make any judgments about what should follow.
And lady in the aisle there, please.
Hello, Claire Willman. I work in the Director's Office here at the Institute. I was very encouraged by your express commitment to include wording in the treaty referring to the disproportionate impact of armed violence on women. My concern is that clauses that acknowledge the gendered aspects of violence in past legislation often do so very briefly and sweepingly, and in reality largely ignored in the enactment of the legislation. And I just wondered if you could comment further on the extent to which the gendered aspects of armed violence, and it is one of the most gendered phenomena that we know, will be accounted for and acknowledged in the negotiations. And, for example, I was wondering the extent to which women's groups and organisations have been consulted in the lead-up to the negotiations.
Well, I think enormously. I mean, we know exactly what the development significance is of violence against women and its sort of prevalence. And so we're very keen to see it acknowledged in the treaty. It is a sort of thing that's, very difficult to distill into strict do's and don'ts within a framework of quasi-law in the treaty. But we want it to be in there. And frankly, I don't see how anyone can possibly not want it to be in there. So, as I tried to say in my speech, it's there along with sustainable development and corruption and wanting to have small arms and ammunition in there. So I very much hope it will be. It needs to be. And we will be pushing for it as hard as we possibly can.
We're running out of time, but we do have enough time for two more questions. You, sir, in the middle here.
Hello, Sir Peter Norris, former RAF pilot. You've touched on the equipment side of life. Could you say the extent to which any of the associated services, small s, might be involved? I'm thinking of things like training and support activity, the extent to which that is or is not included in the points that the treaty is likely to cover.
I'm not 100% sure is the answer. I'm looking at my officials whose nod I'm not sure quite how to interpret. I think we have the scope to choose to put it within it, and of course we still have our own, or can have our own, stricter set of rules should we so wish. I think it's in, but don't take my word as gospel on this one.
Needs to be a more efficient semaphoring.
We'll get some very clever brains working on this very quickly.
And Jiri Rajendran.
Thank you. You've spoken at length of what the treaty should include. I'd wonder if you could describe in more detail what enforcement regime the UK is envisaging when advocating for straits which transgress any eventually agreed treaty. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it is important. I mean, as I think I've tried to explain, it's not setting up, the equivalent of an international court to adjudicate on conduct and then impose penalties. This is much more collective. What did I describe it as? Sort of collective exposure or something. Consensual exposure. That countries are coming together to agree that they will, within their own countries, set a regime which meets the right standard and enforce it within their own countries, and that should a country sign up to a treaty and just ignore it, there will be enough information to allow people, as it were, to gang up on them and make them adhere. So it's the latter rather than the former, and it's not perfect, and it has its weaknesses, but it's a darn sight better than not having anything at all.
Well, thank you very much indeed for coming here, for making the case so strongly and so clearly. And clearly there's also quite a challenge still between now and July, but we wish you the very best of luck with that. Thank you.